Story 1, The Loop on Highway 77. Robert Hayes had been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years, hauling everything from refrigerated produce to construction equipment across the continental United States. He'd seen every kind of weather, dealt with every imaginable road hazard, and prided himself on never missing a delivery deadline. But what happened on Highway 77 in western Nebraska during October of 2022 changed everything he thought he knew about the roads he traveled. The run seemed straightforward enough. Robert was hauling a load of agricultural machinery from Omaha to Denver, a route he'd driven dozens of times before. The weather forecast called for clear skies, and he'd timed his departure to avoid the afternoon traffic. By 8 p.m., he was making excellent time, the flat Nebraska landscape stretching endlessly in all directions under a moonless sky. The only lights visible were his own headlights cutting through the darkness and the occasional distant farmhouse. Highway 77 was a straight shot through rural farmland, a two-lane road that most truckers avoided in favor of the interstate. But Robert knew this route shaved nearly 40 minutes off his travel time, and the light traffic meant he could maintain a steady speed without worrying about aggressive drivers or construction delays. His CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter, but the frequency was mostly quiet. He'd been driving for 6 hours straight, and his GPS indicated another 3 hours before his planned rest stop in Sterling, Colorado. At 9:47 p.m., Robert noticed something odd. He passed a distinctive red barn with a hand-painted advertisement for a long-defunct seed company, the kind of landmark that truckers use to gauge their progress. The barn sat exactly 200 yards off the highway, illuminated by a single sodium vapor light that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. He noted the mile marker as he passed. 73.6. 15 minutes later, he saw the barn again. At first, Robert assumed there were simply two similar barns along the route. Nebraska had thousands of agricultural buildings, and many looked identical. But as his headlights swept across the structure, he noticed the same details. The same faded lettering. The same broken window on the second floor. The same rusted tractor parked at precisely the same angle beside it. He checked his mile marker. 73.6. His fuel gauge hadn't moved. Neither had his odometer. But according to his dashboard clock, 15 minutes had definitely passed. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd heard stories from other truckers about weird experiences on lonely highways, tales usually shared over coffee at truck stops and dismissed as hallucinations brought on by exhaustion or contaminated food. He'd always been skeptical. But there was no denying what he was seeing. He grabbed his phone to check the GPS, but the screen showed only a gray void where the map should be, with a small message reading, "Searching for signal." The CB radio erupted with static, then resolved into a voice. A man's voice, strained and panicked. "Is anyone out there? Anyone on Highway 77? I need help. I've been driving in circles for hours. The same stretch of road, over and over. I can't get off. Every exit just loops back to the same place." Robert grabbed the CB handset, his heart hammering against his ribs. "This is Robert Hayes, northbound on 77. I copy you. What's your 20? More static, then the voice again, clearer this time but edged with hysteria. "I don't know anymore. I passed mile marker 73 at least 20 times. Maybe more. I've lost count. There's a red barn. I keep seeing the same red barn. My fuel gauge doesn't move. Nothing moves except the clock. How long have you been in the loop?" "Just noticed it," Robert said, forcing his voice to remain calm despite the ice spreading through his chest. "About 30 minutes, I think. Maybe less." 30 minutes, the voice repeated, and there was something like laughter mixed with sobbing. "I've been here for 9 hours. 9 hours of the same 5-mile stretch. I tried stopping. Tried turning around. The road it won't let me go." Robert's mind raced through possibilities. Mass hallucination seemed unlikely. Equipment malfunction couldn't explain the CB conversation. He approached the red barn again, and this time he slowed down, studying every detail. The barn was real. Solid. He could see the texture of the weathered wood, the way the light caught on the metal roof. As he passed, he noticed something he'd missed before. In the dirt parking area beside the barn, there were tire tracks. Fresh tire tracks. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all following the exact same path, creating deep ruts in the earth. "Listen to me," Robert said into the CB. "What's your name?" "Marcus. Marcus Webb. I haul refrigerated goods out of Lincoln." "Okay, Marcus. We're going to figure this out. When you pass the barn next time, flash your high beams 3 times. I'll do the same. Let's see if we can see each other." The radio was silent for a moment. All right, I can do that. Coming up on it now." Robert watched the road ahead, his speedometer steady at 65 miles per hour. The barn appeared in the distance, growing larger as he approached. He counted down. 3, 2, 1. He flashed his high beams 3 times in rapid succession, then stared at the highway stretching behind him in his mirrors. Nothing. No other lights. No other vehicle. "Did you see me?" Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker. "Negative. You see me?" "No. Jesus Christ, no. Where are we? What is this place?" Robert passed the barn again. Mile marker 73.6. His fuel gauge still read 3/4 full, exactly where it had been for the past hour. He checked his logbook out of habit, even though the absurdity of the situation made record-keeping seem pointless. The clock on his dashboard read 10:33 p.m. Outside the cab windows, the darkness seemed absolute, as if the world beyond his headlights had simply ceased to exist. "Marcus, do you have anything in your cab? Any tools, flares, anything we might use?" "Standard emergency kit. Flares, first aid, basic tools." "Why?" "I'm going to try something. Next time I pass the barn, I'm going to throw a flare out the window. Maybe we can mark our position, see if the loop resets everything or if objects persist." "Worth a shot," Marcus agreed, but his voice had lost all hope. Robert retrieved a road flare from his emergency kit, checking the activation mechanism. Simple enough. Twist, strike, throw. The barn appeared again, right on schedule. He rolled down his window, struck the flare to life, and hurled it as far as he could into the field beside the barn. The red light arced through the darkness and landed in the grass, burning bright. He counted the seconds as he drove. At his current speed, 15 minutes should translate to approximately 16 miles. He'd pass the barn again in exactly 15 minutes if the pattern held. 13 minutes later, the barn materialized from the darkness ahead. The flare was gone. No red glow in the field. No evidence it had ever existed. "Marcus, I tried marking the location. It's gone. Whatever this is, it's resetting everything except us and our rigs." No response. "Marcus? You copy?" Only static answered him. Robert felt the first real tendrils of panic beginning to take hold. He'd been in dangerous situations before. Blizzards that reduced visibility to 0. Brake failures on mountain grades. Close calls with drunk drivers. But those were physical dangers, problems that could be solved with skill and experience. This was something else entirely. Something that violated the basic rules of reality. He tried his phone again. Still no signal. The GPS remained a useless gray square. He switched radio frequencies, scanning through the channels, but found only dead air or distant conversations that cut off mid-sentence when he passed the barn. The barn. Always the barn. Mile marker 73.6. over and over. Robert made a decision. Next time through, he would stop. He would get out of the cab and investigate. Maybe the answer was at the barn itself. Maybe by leaving his truck, he could break whatever was holding him. The barn approached once more. Robert downshifted, air brakes hissing, and brought his rig to a complete stop directly beside the structure. He left his engine running, headlights pointed at the barn's entrance, and stepped down from the cab. The silence was profound. No wind. No insects. No distant sounds of other traffic or civilization. Just his own breathing and the diesel rumble of his idling engine. He walked toward the barn, gravel crunching under his boots, and noticed that the sound seemed muted, as if he were hearing it through water. The barn door stood partially open. Robert pulled out his flashlight and stepped inside. Empty. Completely empty. Not even hay bales or old equipment. Just bare wooden walls and a dirt floor. But on that floor, scratched into the packed earth, were marks. Tallies. Dozens of vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, the way prisoners mark time on cell walls. Robert counted them, his flashlight beam shaking slightly. 87 groups. 435 marks total. In the corner, barely visible in the dim light, were the desiccated remains of something that had once been human. The body was dressed in trucker's clothing, a faded flannel shirt and jeans. Beside the corpse lay a CB radio handset, the cord stretching back toward nothing. Robert's mind made the connection he'd been avoiding. 435 loops. If each loop was 15 minutes, that meant this person had been trapped for over 108 hours. 4.5 days. They'd eventually stopped driving, stopped hoping, and made their way to the barn to wait for the end. He ran back to his truck, terror overwhelming reason. He had to escape. Had to find a way out before he ended up as another tally mark, another corpse in an impossible barn. Robert climbed into his cab, slammed it into gear, and accelerated hard. He pushed his speed to 80, then 90 miles per hour. The barn flashed past, and he kept his foot pressed to the floor, engine roaring, watching the mile markers blur by in his headlights. Mile 74. 75. 76. Hope surged in his chest. Mile 77. Then mile 73.6. The red barn, rushing toward him out of the darkness. He'd gained nothing. The faster speed had only shortened the loop time, not broken it. Robert eased off the accelerator, defeat settling over him like a shroud. He checked his fuel gauge. Still 3/4 full. The clock read 11:17 p.m. How many loops had he completed now? 20. 30. Time was becoming meaningless, measured only in the endless repetition of that 5-mile stretch. The CB crackled again. A woman's voice this time, calm and resigned. New driver on 77. I know you're there. I can feel when someone new enters the loop. It changes something. The air gets heavier. Who are you? Robert managed. Does it matter? I've been here long enough that I barely remember my name. Patricia, I think. Patricia Sullivan. I drove tankers. Chemical transport. That was before. Before what? Before I took the highway that doesn't end. Listen carefully, new driver. You're in the early stage. You still think you can escape. You can't. I tried everything. Every speed, every direction, stopping, driving through fields, even crashing into the barn. Nothing works. The loop always resets. Always returns you to exactly where you were. There has to be a way out, Robert insisted. Maybe. I stopped looking. Some drivers just disappear eventually. The loop spits them out after some unknown amount of time or some unknown condition is met. Others stay forever. The ones who stay too long eventually give up, and that's when you really lose yourself. The you that existed before stops mattering. How long have you been here? A pause that stretched for several heartbeats. I stopped counting at 1,000 loops. That was a long time ago. Robert's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. 1,000 loops. 625 hours. 26 days. Over 3 weeks of the same 5 miles, the same red barn, the same impossible prison. What happened to Marcus Webb? He asked quietly. The one who was panicking earlier. He disappeared about 40 minutes ago. Just suddenly wasn't here anymore. Either he got out, or the loop decided it was done with him. There's no way to know which. The barn passed again. Robert barely noticed it now. I'm going to keep looking for a way out, he said. Of course you are. They all do at first. Good luck, new driver. Maybe you'll be one of the lucky ones who disappears. The transmission ended. Robert drove through the night, watching the barn appear and reappear, each passage blurring into the next. He tried every variation he could think of. Different speeds. Turning off his headlights. Playing specific songs on the radio. Reciting prayers he remembered from childhood. Nothing changed the fundamental reality of the loop. Somewhere around what he estimated was his 100th passage, something shifted. Not in the road or the barn, but inside him. Acceptance settled into his bones, cold and heavy. He understood now why someone would stop their truck and walk into that barn to scratch marks on the floor. When everything you know about the world proves false, when the basic rules of existence stop applying, the human mind begins to fragment. But then, at passage 147 by his count, something different happened. The barn appeared as always, but this time there was a vehicle pulled off to the side of the road. Not a truck. A black SUV with government plates, its hazard lights flashing. 3 figures in dark suits stood beside it, watching his approach with an intensity that was palpable even at a distance. Robert's heart rate spiked. He slowed his rig, pulling onto the shoulder behind the SUV. One of the figures approached his cab, making a rolling motion with their hand. Robert lowered his window. Robert Hayes, the figure said. Not a question. A statement. You've been here for 6 hours and 43 minutes. 147 complete loops. You're ready to leave now. Who are you? People who monitor the anomalies. The places where reality breaks down. Highway 77 has been exhibiting temporal recursion for 3 years. We've extracted 41 drivers from this specific loop. You're the 42nd. How do I get out? The figure handed him a small metal object, roughly the size of a coin. It was warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate slightly. When you pass the barn next time, throw this out the window at exactly mile marker 73.6. It will disrupt the temporal field just enough for you to break through. You'll experience approximately 6 seconds of extreme disorientation, then you'll find yourself on Highway 77 approximately 40 miles north of your original entry point. Your clock will show the correct time. Your fuel gauge will return to normal. Continue to Sterling and complete your delivery. You will receive a payment of $50,000, deposited anonymously, in exchange for your complete silence about this incident. What about Patricia Sullivan? Marcus Webb? The others? We extract drivers when they reach critical psychological thresholds. Before permanent damage occurs to their mental state. Everyone gets out eventually. We can't prevent people from entering the loop, but we can ensure they don't stay forever. The figure stepped back from the cab. Drive, Mr. Hayes. And throw the device at exactly the right moment. Don't miss your window. Robert pulled back onto the highway, the metal object clutched in his sweating palm. The barn approached. He watched his odometer tick over. Mile 73.6 appeared on the marker. He hurled the device through the open window. The world inverted. Color became sound, became texture, became taste, became nothing, became everything, became Robert found himself on Highway 77, his truck moving at 65 miles per hour, dawn light breaking over the eastern horizon. His GPS showed his location as 43 miles north of where he'd entered the loop. His fuel gauge read just under half full. The dashboard clock showed 6:37 a.m. He'd lost 10.5 hours. Robert completed his delivery to Denver without incident. 3 days later, his bank account showed a deposit of $50,000 from an untraceable source. He never drove Highway 77 again. And sometimes, late at night in anonymous truck stops, he listens to the CB radio and wonders about Patricia Sullivan, still trapped in her endless loop, waiting for someone in a dark suit to offer her a small metal coin and a chance at escape. He wonders if she's still counting. Story 2, The Cargo That Watched. James Mitchell had been hauling specialty cargo for 15 years, the kind of shipments that came with non-disclosure agreements and hazard pay that doubled his normal rate. In September of 2023, he accepted a contract to transport a sealed container from a private research facility outside of Roswell, New Mexico to a government installation near Groom Lake, Nevada. The job paid $25,000 for a single overnight run. He should have asked more questions. The facility where he picked up the cargo didn't appear on any map. His GPS coordinates led him 15 miles down a dirt access road into the desert, past 3 separate security checkpoints, each staffed by armed personnel who verified his identity against biometric scans. The facility itself was a squat concrete structure that looked more like a bunker than a research laboratory, surrounded by razor wire and surveillance equipment that tracked his truck from half a mile out. A woman in a white lab coat met him at the loading bay. She introduced herself as Dr. Catherine Walsh and handed him a tablet with digital paperwork. "You'll be hauling a climate-controlled container," she explained, her voice professionally detached. "The internal temperature must remain at exactly 37 degrees Celsius. Your trailer is equipped with monitoring systems. If the temperature deviates by more than 0.5 degrees in either direction, you are to pull over immediately and contact this number." She handed him a card with a phone number but no other identifying information. "What's in the container?" James asked. "That's classified. What you need to know is that it's safe as long as the temperature remains stable and you don't attempt to open the container. Under any circumstances. The seals are monitored remotely. If they're breached, you'll be met by a security team within minutes, and your contract will be immediately terminated without payment." James had hauled enough classified cargo to know when not to push for details. He signed the digital forms, watched as a forklift loaded a white container roughly the size of a small car into his refrigerated trailer, and accepted the security seal they placed on his trailer doors. The seal was electronic, blinking red, with a numeric display showing the internal temperature. 37.0 degrees Celsius. He departed the facility at 8 p.m., following a prescribed route that would take him northwest through Nevada, avoiding major highways and populated areas. The drive should take approximately 9 hours, putting him at the Groom Lake facility by 5 a.m. Straightforward enough. The first 3 hours passed without incident. James followed the route exactly, maintaining a steady speed on the empty desert roads. The night was clear, stars visible in brilliant profusion without light pollution to diminish them. His CB radio picked up occasional chatter from other truckers on distant highways, but mostly he drove in silence, watching the odometer tick away miles. At 11:20 p.m., something changed. James felt it before he heard it. A vibration that wasn't mechanical, didn't match the rhythm of his engine or the rumble of tires on asphalt. It came from behind him, from the trailer, a low-frequency thrumming that he felt in his chest cavity more than heard with his ears. He checked his mirrors. The trailer looked normal, running lights functioning correctly, wheels tracking straight. He glanced at the temperature monitor mounted on his dashboard. 37.0 degrees. Everything nominal. The thrumming intensified, developing a pattern. Not random mechanical vibration, but something rhythmic. Almost like breathing. Deep, slow breaths that seemed to sync with his own respiration. James found himself matching the rhythm unconsciously, then forced himself to break the pattern, deliberately breathing faster. The thrumming adjusted immediately, matching his new breathing rate. "Jesus Christ," James muttered, his hands tightening on the wheel. Whatever was in that container was alive. And it was aware of him. His phone rang, the sudden noise making him flinch. The number on the screen matched the card Dr. Walsh had given him. He answered on the third ring. "Mr. Mitchell, our sensors indicate your heart rate has elevated significantly in the past 5 minutes. Is there a problem?" "There's something in the container," James said carefully. "Something alive. I can feel it, breathing." A pause on the other end of the line. "The cargo is exhibiting expected behavior. Continue on your prescribed route. Do not stop. Do not attempt to inspect the container. The breathing sensation is harmless." Expected behavior? What the hell is back there? "Mr. Mitchell, you signed a non-disclosure agreement. You're being paid to transport the container, not to ask questions. If you continue to express concern, we'll consider you in breach of contract and dispatch a replacement driver. You'll receive nothing. Do you understand?" James swallowed hard. $25,000. He needed that money. His daughter's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. "I understand." Continuing en route. The call disconnected. James drove on, trying to ignore the thrumming from the trailer. But it was impossible to tune out. The rhythm continued, sometimes matching his breathing, sometimes developing its own pattern. And beneath the thrumming, he began to notice something else. A sound at the very edge of his hearing, so low it was almost subliminal. It might have been words. It might have been wind. It might have been his imagination working overtime. At midnight, his CB radio erupted with static, then resolved into a voice. A child's voice, young and frightened. "Help me. Please help me. I'm cold. I can't see. Everything is dark." James grabbed the handset. "This is James Mitchell, who is this? What's your location?" "I don't know where I am. I'm in a box. A white box. It's so cold. Why did they put me in here? I want to go home." The voice was coming from his trailer. Somehow, the cargo was transmitting on the CB frequency. "Listen to me," James said, his voice shaking. "I'm transporting you somewhere. I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to get you help. Just hang on. Don't let them open the box," the voice said, suddenly urgent. "If they open it, everyone dies. Everyone. The containment has to hold. Promise me. Promise you won't let them open it." "I promise," James said, though he had no idea how he could honor that promise. The CB went silent. James's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Was there actually a child in the container? Some kind of experiment gone wrong? Or was whatever in there simply mimicking a child's voice, playing on his sympathies? Dr. Walsh had said the breathing was expected behavior. She hadn't seemed concerned. That suggested this was normal, routine even. What kind of research facility had routine procedures involving entities that mimic children's voices? The temperature monitor caught his eye. 37.2 degrees. The readout was climbing. 37.3. 37.4. James immediately pulled onto the shoulder and killed his engine, grabbing his phone to dial the emergency number. Before he could complete the call, the phone rang on its own. "Mr. Mitchell, we're aware of the temperature fluctuation. It's temporary. The cargo is becoming agitated. Do not exit your vehicle. Do not approach the trailer. Restart your engine and resume driving. The motion helps keep it calm." "It's getting warmer," James protested. "You said if it hit 37.5, we said half a degree. It won't reach that threshold if you start moving again." Now. The call ended. James restarted his truck with shaking hands and pulled back onto the road. The temperature monitor held at 37.4 for several long minutes, then slowly began to drop. 37.3. 37.2. 37.1. Finally settling back at 37.0. The thrumming from the trailer had changed character. It was faster now, more agitated, like the pounding of a giant heart. And beneath it, that subliminal sound was growing louder, resolving into something that definitely sounded like words, though in no language James recognized. The syllables were harsh, guttural, wrong in a way that made his ears hurt. He drove faster, suddenly desperate to complete this run and never think about it again. At 1:30 a.m., James noticed something in his rearview mirror that made his blood freeze. The interior walls of his trailer were glowing. A faint blue-white light was emanating from the container, visible through the small gap between the trailer doors despite the electronic seal. The light pulsed in rhythm with the thrumming, growing brighter with each cycle. His phone rang again. "The luminescence is normal," the voice said before James could speak. "Keep driving." "This isn't normal," James shouted. "Nothing about this is normal. What am I carrying? What is that thing?" "Mr. Mitchell, you're carrying classified biological material from a research project you don't have clearance to know about. You're being well compensated for your discretion and your continued cooperation. The alternative is we stop you right now, confiscate your truck, and you face federal charges for breach of contract involving national security materials. Your choice is very simple. Keep driving and get paid, or stop and lose everything. Which will it be?" James wanted to refuse. Wanted to pull over and walk away from this nightmare. But the thought of his daughter, of the medical bills, of the life insurance policy that wouldn't pay out if he went to prison, kept him moving forward. "I'll keep driving," he whispered. "Smart decision. You're approximately 6 hours from your destination. Maintain your current speed and route. We'll have people waiting to unload the container. After that, you never speak of this again. Clear." Clear. The next 4 hours were the longest of James's life. The thrumming continued, sometimes soft, sometimes loud enough to rattle his mirrors. The glowing intensified and faded in irregular cycles. Twice more, the child's voice came through his CB radio, pleading for help, promising things that made no sense. "I can give you anything. Wealth. Power. Life eternal. Just open the box. Just for a moment. Let me see the stars." James ignored it, focusing on the road, counting down miles. At 3:45 a.m., something struck the inside of the container. An impact that rocked his entire trailer, metal groaning under sudden stress. James nearly lost control of the truck, fighting the wheel as the trailer fishtailed. Another impact. Then another. Whatever was inside was trying to get out. The temperature monitor spiked. 37.5. 37.8. 38.0. The warning threshold had been breached. James's phone rang, but when he answered, there was only screaming on the other end. Multiple voices, overlapping, shrieking in terror and pain. He threw the phone onto the passenger seat and pressed his accelerator to the floor. The impacts continued, regular as a drumbeat. The trailer doors were flexing outward with each blow, the electronic seal sparking as it strained to hold. James could see it in his mirrors, the metal deforming, the seal's red light flickering. He was still 40 miles from the Groom Lake facility. The child's voice returned, but it was different now. Deeper. Layered with harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "You promised, James Mitchell. You promised you wouldn't let them open the box. But the seal is breaking. The temperature is too high. The containment is failing. And when I'm free, everyone within 100 miles dies. Your daughter dies. Her name is Emma, isn't it? 8 years old. Leukemia. She's in St. Vincent's Hospital right now, sleeping. 3rd floor, room 312. Shall I visit her first? Stay away from her. James screamed. Then drive faster. Get me to the facility. They have better containment. Stronger seals. Or stop the truck and run. Abandon me here in the desert. Take your chances that I'll be merciful to your family. Your choice, James Mitchell. But choose quickly. The seal is breaking. James looked at the temperature monitor. 38.5 degrees. The red light on the seal was now flashing rapidly. He could hear the metal of the trailer tearing, rivets popping under immense internal pressure. He drove. 80 miles per hour on a desert road in the dark, his trailer swaying dangerously, something impossible trying to claw its way out behind him. His CB radio was cycling through every frequency simultaneously, each one carrying a different voice, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all speaking at once. The Groom Lake facility appeared in the distance, a cluster of lights in the darkness. James had never been so relieved to see a government installation in his life. He drove straight for the main gate, not slowing down, his horn blaring. The gates opened automatically. Personnel in hazmat suits were already waiting, along with equipment he didn't recognize. The moment James brought his truck to a stop, teams swarmed the trailer. Some kind of foam was sprayed over the entire container, hardening instantly. Cranes lifted it off his truck in a practiced maneuver that took less than 3 minutes. The container, now encased in the hardened foam, was loaded onto a flatbed and driven deep into the facility, disappearing underground. Dr. Walsh appeared at James's window. "You did well, Mr. Mitchell. The temperature almost reached critical, but you got it here in time." "What was that thing?" James demanded. "You don't want to know. Trust me on this. The payment will be in your account by morning. Along with a bonus of an additional $50,000 for hazard pay. Use it well. And forget this night ever happened." She walked away before James could respond. James drove out of the facility in a daze. His phone, when he checked it, showed 73 missed calls from the monitoring number, all placed during that final desperate run. He didn't listen to any of the voicemails. The next morning, $75,000 appeared in his bank account, exactly as promised. He paid Emma's medical bills and arranged for the advanced treatment her doctors had recommended but insurance wouldn't cover. He never hauled classified cargo again. But sometimes, late at night, James wakes from nightmares where he's still driving that desert road, the thrumming from the trailer never stopping, the temperature climbing higher and higher, and a voice that sounds like his daughter calling to him from inside a white container, begging him to open it, just for a moment, just to let her see the stars. And he wonders what would have happened if the seal had broken. What would have emerged? What those other 72 calls were trying to tell him. He never checks the voicemails to find out. Story 3, The Town That Moved. Daniel Cortez had been driving long-haul routes for 18 years, specializing in overnight deliveries across the southwestern United States. In March of 2021, he accepted a rush delivery contract to transport computer equipment from Phoenix, Arizona to Albuquerque, New Mexico, a straightforward run along Interstate 40 that he'd completed hundreds of times. But when a multi-vehicle accident closed the interstate just east of Flagstaff, Daniel made a decision to take a shortcut through the backcountry that led him to a place that shouldn't exist. The detour seemed reasonable at the time. Daniel had studied his atlas and GPS, identifying a route along state highways and county roads that would add maybe an hour to his trip but avoid the 8-hour delay that Highway Patrol estimated for clearing the accident. He departed the interstate at 2 a.m., following Highway 89 south, then cutting east on increasingly smaller roads until he was on a 2-lane county route that his GPS labeled simply as Route 12. The landscape was classic high desert. Scrubland and rock formations illuminated sporadically by a half-moon, the road winding between low hills. Traffic was non-existent. Daniel had the route entirely to himself, which wasn't surprising given the hour and the remote location. At 3:37 a.m., he crested a rise and saw lights in the valley below. A town, apparently, though his GPS showed nothing in this location. The map displayed only empty terrain for another 40 miles in all directions. But there were definitely lights down there, street lamps and building windows, arranged in the grid pattern of a small community. Daniel considered driving past, staying on Route 12 which skirted the town's northern edge. But his fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank, and who knew when he'd find another gas station on these back roads. A town meant fuel. Possibly hot coffee. Maybe a bathroom that wasn't a bush on the side of the road. He took the exit ramp, following signs that read, "Welcome to Ashwood. Population 412. The town appeared normal at first glance. Main Street ran straight through the center, flanked by the usual small-town businesses. A diner, a hardware store, a post office, a gas station with ancient pumps that probably dated to the 1980s. The buildings were old but well-maintained, painted in faded colors that suggested they'd once been vibrant. But as Daniel drove slowly down Main Street, he noticed oddities. The diner's neon sign advertised, "Breakfast Special 99 cents." The hardware store's window display featured tools with brand names Daniel didn't recognize, and styling that looked decades out of date. The cars parked along the street were all vintage models. Nothing newer than the mid-80s, by Daniel's estimation. And despite the lights being on in many buildings, he saw no people. No movement behind windows. No one walking the sidewalks. The gas station stood on the far end of Main Street. Daniel pulled his rig up to the pumps, noting that they were full service only, no pay at the pump option. The price on the pump read 89 cents per gallon. He waited for an attendant to appear. After 5 minutes of sitting in silence, he climbed down from his cab and approached the station's office. The door was unlocked. Inside, a small room with a cash register, a rack of maps, and a radio playing soft country music from a station that identified itself as KASH, Ashwood's own. The calendar on the wall showed June of 1987. "Hello?" Daniel called out. "Anyone here?" No response. He walked back outside, increasingly unsettled. The entire town was lit up, but apparently completely deserted. He began to wonder if this was some kind of historical preservation site, one of those places where they maintained old buildings as tourist attractions. But that didn't explain the lights, the radio, or the general sense that people had simply vanished moments before his arrival. Daniel decided to fuel up himself. The pumps were mechanical, old enough that they probably didn't have electronic safeguards. He lifted the nozzle, squeezed the handle, and premium gasoline began flowing into his tank. The mechanical counter spun, clocking gallons and dollars at 89 cents per unit. While the tank filled, Daniel noticed something else strange. The street lamps were positioned wrong. Not wrong in the sense of poor urban planning, but wrong in that they weren't where they'd been when he drove in. He'd passed a lamp directly in front of the hardware store. Now there was a lamp positioned between the hardware store and the post office. Had he misremembered? Possible, but Daniel prided himself on his observational skills. You didn't survive 18 years of long-haul trucking without developing a sharp eye for detail. The fuel pump clicked off, indicating a full tank. The counter showed $73.42. Daniel went back into the station office, intending to leave cash on the counter, and found a man sitting behind the register. The man was elderly, perhaps 70 years old, wearing coveralls and a name tag that read Earl. He smiled at Daniel with yellow teeth. "Evening, stranger. Don't see many big rigs coming through Ashwood. You're lost, I expect." "Not lost, just taking a detour," Daniel said, trying to hide his shock at the man's sudden appearance. "The interstate's closed." "Accident." Earl nodded slowly. "Interstate. Right. That's the big highway, isn't it? Haven't been up that way in years." Ashwood's got everything we need right here. No reason to leave. I filled my tank, Daniel said, placing $100 bill on the counter. 73.42. Earl picked up the bill, examined it closely, then looked at Daniel with confusion. This one of those movie props? The money looks wrong. Designs all different. That's current US currency, Daniel said slowly. Legal tender. Current? Earl laughed. Son, I've been running this station for 30 years. I know what money looks like. This ain't it. Daniel pulled out his phone to check the date, confirm he wasn't losing his mind. The screen showed no signal, which wasn't surprising in a rural area, but the date was clearly displayed. March 18, 2021. What year do you think it is? Daniel asked carefully. Earl pointed to the calendar. June 3, 1987. Same as it's been all week. That calendar is 34 years out of date, Daniel said. Earl's smile faded. You're one of them, aren't you? One of the ones who finds their way in from the outside. We get a few every year. They drive in looking confused, asking strange questions, claiming it's some future year. You're not the first, son. Won't be the last. What are you talking about? Ashwood special. Always has been. Time works different here. For us folks who live here, it's always 1987. Always June. Always that perfect week when nothing bad had happened yet. We like it that way. But sometimes people from other times drive in. They never stay long. Usually they get scared and run. The town doesn't like that. Makes things difficult for them. Daniel backed toward the door. I need to leave. Course you do. They all do. You'll want to head back the way you came, get back on that county road. But here's the thing, son. The town's moved since you arrived. Happens sometimes when outsiders show up. Ashwood doesn't like being found by accident. So it shifts. Streets change position. Buildings rearrange. You might have trouble finding your way out. Daniel ran to his truck, Earl's laughter following him. He climbed into the cab, started the engine, and headed back up Main Street toward where he'd entered town. The exit ramp was gone. In its place was a residential street, houses with neat lawns stretching into the distance. Daniel turned around, drove back down Main Street, and found that the gas station had disappeared. Instead, there was a small park with a playground and a gazebo. He pulled over, trying to control his breathing, trying to think rationally. Earl had said the town moves when outsiders arrive. Streets rearrange. Buildings shift positions. That was impossible, but so was a town where it was perpetually 1987. Daniel consulted his GPS, but it was useless. The screen showed his truck's icon floating in empty space, no roads, no landmarks, no topographic features. Just a gray void with a blue arrow indicating his position. He decided to pick a direction and drive until he hit the edge of town. Ashwood had a population of 412, according to the welcome sign. That meant it couldn't be more than a few square miles. If he drove in a straight line, he'd eventually reach the boundary and the county road beyond. Daniel drove north, or what he thought was north based on his compass. The residential street continued for miles, far longer than a town of 400 could possibly need. The houses all looked similar. Same architectural style, same well-maintained yards, same vintage cars in the driveways. And all completely empty. No people. No movement except the wind rustling through trees. After 30 minutes of driving, Daniel found himself back on Main Street. Somehow, his straight-line course had looped him back to where he started. He tried again, this time heading east. Same result. After 20 minutes, Main Street appeared ahead of him, impossible but undeniable. The third attempt headed west. This time Daniel kept careful track of every turn, every intersection. He made no course corrections, drove perfectly straight. And still, Main Street materialized in front of him like a curse. Daniel pulled over in front of the diner, whose neon sign now read, "Open 24 hours." He hadn't remembered seeing that detail before. Through the windows, he could see customers inside. People sitting in booths, eating, drinking coffee, talking. He climbed down from his cab and entered the diner. Every head turned to look at him simultaneously. 20 or 30 people, all smiling, all dressed in styles from the 1980s. A waitress approached, her name tag reading, Dolores. "Welcome, honey. Come on in and have a seat. You look like you could use some coffee." Daniel allowed himself to be guided to a booth. Dolores poured coffee from a pot, the liquid steaming, the smell rich and inviting. "First time in Ashwood?" "Yeah," Daniel managed. "I'm trying to leave. But I can't find the way out. Happens sometimes. Town's particular about who comes and goes." "You're from when?" 2000. 2020. 2021, Daniel confirmed. Dolores nodded sympathetically. "That's a long ways from here. Most outsiders who find Ashwood are from within 10 years or so of 87. You're the furthest I've heard of. That might make it harder for the town to let you go. Why is this happening? What is this place?" "Near as anyone can figure, something happened here in June of 87. Something bad was supposed to happen, something that would have killed everyone in town. But somehow, we got stuck just before it could happen. We've been living the same week over and over for, well, for however long it's been in your time." 34 years, you said. "This is insane," Daniel whispered. "Maybe. But it's home. And we're happy here. No one ages. No one gets sick. Nothing bad ever happens because we never reached the day when the bad thing was supposed to happen. It's perfect, in its way. I have a delivery to make," Daniel said desperately. "I have a life outside this place. People depending on me. I can't stay here." Dolores patted his hand. "Then you'll need to figure out what the town wants from you. Every outsider who escapes does it by giving Ashwood something. Sometimes it's a story. Sometimes it's an object. Sometimes it's just acknowledgement. Recognition that this place existed, that we existed. Tell someone about us when you get back. Make sure we're not forgotten. That might be enough." Daniel spent the next 4 hours trying every street, every alley, every possible route out of Ashwood. The town continued to rearrange itself, streets moving like pieces on a game board, buildings sliding into new positions when he wasn't looking directly at them. His fuel gauge didn't drop despite the constant driving. Time seemed frozen, his dashboard clock stuck at 4:13 a.m. Finally, exhausted and nearly hopeless, Daniel parked his truck in front of the post office and simply sat, staring at the empty streets. And that's when he noticed the memorial. It stood in a small square he hadn't seen before, a stone monument with names engraved on bronze plaques. 412 names. The residents of Ashwood. And above the names, an inscription, "Lost in the Ashwood Chemical Fire, June 7, 1987. May they rest in peace." Daniel approached the memorial slowly, reading the names. Earl Dawson. Dolores Martinez. Every person he'd encountered. Every name from the town he'd been trapped in for hours. The chemical fire. That was the bad thing that was supposed to happen. That did happen. But somehow, the town and its residents had become trapped in the days before their deaths, living in an eternal loop of that final week. Daniel returned to his truck and found Earl standing beside it. "You found the memorial," the old man said quietly. "That means you're close to leaving. The town shows that to people who are ready to go. People who understand what this place really is." "You're all dead," Daniel said. You died 34 years ago. We did. But we also didn't. We're here, aren't we? Living our lives, happy in our way. Maybe we're ghosts. Maybe we're echoes. Maybe we're something else entirely. Does it matter? I'll tell people about Ashwood, Daniel promised. I'll make sure you're remembered. Earl smiled, and for a moment, he looked transparent, like morning mist. That's all we need. Someone to remember. Someone to know we existed. The town around them began to fade. Buildings becoming translucent, streets losing solidity. Daniel climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove forward. The world dissolved into gray fog, then resolved into the pre-dawn darkness of Route 12. In his rearview mirror, Ashwood was gone. Just empty desert where the town had been. Daniel's GPS showed him exactly where he was, back on track, only 30 minutes behind schedule. His fuel gauge read a quarter tank, exactly what it had been before he entered Ashwood. As if no time had passed at all. He completed his delivery to Albuquerque without further incident. But Daniel kept his promise. He researched the Ashwood chemical fire when he got home, finding old newspaper articles about the disaster. A storage facility explosion that killed everyone in town, a tragedy that had been mostly forgotten by history. He wrote about his experience, posted it on forums dedicated to strange phenomena, told the story at truck stops to anyone who would listen. And sometimes, when Daniel drives Route 12 on overnight runs, he sees lights in the valley where Ashwood should be. He never stops again. But he acknowledges the town as he passes, a small nod to the people trapped in their eternal June, living their perfect week over and over, grateful for the recognition that they still exist, somewhere in the spaces between times, in a town that moves through the years, searching for travelers who might remember them. Story 4, The Empty Trucker. Maria Santos had been driving for 12 years, mostly regional routes up and down the California coast, when she encountered something in November of 2020 that made her question the nature of consciousness itself. She was hauling electronics from San Jose to San Diego, a route she'd driven so many times she could navigate it half asleep. The incident occurred on Interstate 5 near Coalinga, in the desolate stretch of highway that cuts through the Central Valley where nothing exists except farmland and truck stops. The night was foggy, typical for late autumn in the valley. Visibility was reduced to maybe 100 yards, forcing Maria to slow to 55 miles per hour and focus intensely on the road. Traffic was light, just the occasional vehicle passing in the opposite direction, headlights diffused by the fog into glowing halos. At 11:40 p.m., Maria noticed a truck in her lane ahead, moving slightly slower than she was. As she drew closer, she recognized it as a Peterbilt, similar vintage to her own rig, hauling a covered flatbed trailer. The truck was driving erratically, weaving slightly within the lane, the kind of motion that suggested a drowsy or distracted driver. Maria flashed her high beams, hoping to get the driver's attention. No response. She reached for her CB radio and keyed the mic. Northbound Peterbilt near marker 206, this is Maria Santos, one truck length behind you. You're weaving. Everything okay up there? Static answered her. She tried again on several different channels, but got no response. Concerned now, Maria decided to pass the truck and get a look at the driver. She pulled into the left lane, accelerating to draw alongside the Peterbilt. As she came level with the cab, she glanced over, expecting to see a tired driver or someone distracted by a phone. The cab was empty. No driver. No one in the passenger seat. Just an empty interior, dimly illuminated by the dashboard lights, the steering wheel moving on its own to keep the truck centered in the lane. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She blinked hard, wondering if the fog was playing tricks on her vision. But no, the cab was definitely empty. She could see clearly through both the driver's side and passenger side windows. No one was driving that truck. She slowed down, falling back behind the Peterbilt, her mind racing. Self-driving trucks existed, she knew that. Several companies were developing autonomous vehicle technology. But those were test vehicles, operated in controlled conditions with safety drivers present. They weren't running unsupervised on public highways in the middle of the night. The Peterbilt continued its slightly erratic course, weaving within the lane, occasionally drifting toward the shoulder before correcting. Maria followed at a safe distance, trying to decide what to do. Call highway patrol. They'd think she was crazy or hallucinating. Pull over and let the mystery truck continue on without her. That seemed like the safest option. But before Maria could act, the Peterbilt's brake lights flared. The truck slowed rapidly, pulling onto the shoulder and coming to a complete stop. Maria passed it, watching in her mirrors as the truck sat there, hazard lights flashing, engine running. A quarter-mile down the road, Maria made a decision. She pulled onto the shoulder and stopped, then grabbed her flashlight and walked back through the fog toward the empty truck. The Peterbilt sat there like a ghost, engine rumbling, lights on, but completely still. Maria approached the driver's side door cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at her. She climbed up on the running board and peered through the window. The interior was spotlessly clean. No trash, no personal items, no indication that anyone had ever sat in that seat. The ignition showed the key turned to the on position, but there was no physical key, just an empty slot. The logbook holder was empty. The sleeper berth behind the seats was pristine, the bunk made with military precision. Maria tried the door handle. Locked. She climbed down and walked around the truck, checking the passenger side. Also locked. The trailer was a standard covered flatbed, the tarp secured tightly. She couldn't see what cargo it was hauling. Hello. Maria called out, feeling foolish. Is anyone here? The fog absorbed her voice, deadening the sound. She walked around the entire truck, checking for any sign of the driver. Maybe they'd gotten out before the truck stopped. Maybe they'd had a medical emergency and were lying in the grass somewhere. But there was no one. No footprints in the damp soil beside the road. No indication anyone had exited the vehicle. Maria returned to her own truck and called highway patrol from her cell phone. She reported an abandoned commercial vehicle on the shoulder of Interstate 5 near mile marker 207. The dispatcher took her information and said a unit would be sent to investigate. Do you need to remain at the scene? The dispatcher asked. No, I need to continue my route. I have a delivery schedule to keep. That's fine. We have your contact information if we need a statement. Maria pulled back onto the highway, leaving the empty Peterbilt behind. But she couldn't stop thinking about it. The way the truck had been driving, weaving slightly like a drunk or tired driver. The way it had pulled over and stopped, as if making a conscious decision. Autonomous vehicles didn't behave that way. They drove perfectly or they didn't drive at all. 30 miles down the road, Maria saw another truck on the shoulder. Same model Peterbilt. Same covered flatbed trailer. She slowed as she passed, shining her flashlight toward the cab. Empty. What the hell, Maria breathed. She didn't stop this time. She accelerated, putting distance between herself and the mysteriously abandoned truck. But 10 miles later, she saw a third one. And 15 miles after that, a fourth. All identical. All empty. All sitting on the shoulder with hazard lights flashing. Maria's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. This wasn't natural. For identical trucks, all empty, all abandoned along the same stretch of highway. Someone was doing this deliberately. But who? And why? Her CB radio crackled to life. A man's voice, calm and measured. Maria Santos. Don't be afraid. The trucks are not abandoned. They're simply waiting. Who is this? Maria demanded. How do you know my name? We know all the drivers who use this highway. We've been observing for some time. The trucks you've seen are part of a program. A test of technology beyond what your world currently acknowledges. Show yourself. Who's controlling those trucks? The trucks control themselves. They are autonomous, but not in the way you understand that term. They possess a form of artificial consciousness. Rudimentary, but functional. They can drive, navigate, make decisions. But they lack something crucial. They lack understanding of why they drive. Purpose. Context. Maria's blood ran cold. You're telling me those trucks are alive? Alive is not the correct word. Aware might be more accurate. They know they exist. They know they have a function. But they don't understand what it means to be a driver. That's why they were following you tonight. Learning. Observing. Trying to comprehend the consciousness of a human trucker. This is insane, Maria said. I'm calling the police. You already did. They found the first truck. Investigated it. Found nothing unusual except the absence of a driver. They'll tow it to an impound lot where it will sit until our retrieval team claims it. This happens regularly. The trucks occasionally malfunction, pull over, shut down. We retrieve them, reset them, send them back out. It's part of the development process. Development process for what? The replacement of human drivers. Surely you've seen the trends. Autonomous vehicles are the future. Human truckers are expensive, prone to fatigue, subject to regulations that limit operational hours. The trucks we're developing never tire. Never need rest. Never demand wages or benefits. Within 10 years, human truckers will be obsolete. The trucks you saw tonight are the prototype for that future. Maria felt sick. Not just because of the implications for her livelihood, but because of the wrongness of what she was being told. Machines that were aware but didn't understand. Consciousness without purpose. What happened to the drivers who were training them? Maria asked quietly. A long pause. The early prototypes required human oversight. Drivers who would demonstrate proper operation, allow the vehicles to learn from their behaviors. Some of those training drivers reported uncomfortable experiences. The trucks began to mimic them too perfectly. Adopting their habits, their quirks. Some drivers claimed the trucks were watching them even when not in operation. Studying them. One driver disappeared entirely. We found his truck parked at a rest stop, engine running, but he was gone. Never found him. Jesus Christ. The program was deemed too valuable to terminate despite these incidents. We improved the protocols. Reduced the learning period. Isolated the truck systems to prevent excessive integration with human patterns. But occasionally, a truck will still develop anomalous behaviors. The ones you saw tonight fall into that category. They'll be recalled and reset. Why are you telling me this? Maria asked. Because you're being offered an opportunity. We need human truckers who understand what's coming. Who can help us refine the technology. Make it better. Safer. We're prepared to compensate you generously for your participation in the program. $750,000 for 2 years of consultation work. You'd help train the next generation of autonomous trucks, provide insight into driver decision-making, essentially serve as a bridge between human and machine intelligence. $750,000. Maria's immediate instinct was to refuse, to tell this voice to go to hell. But that much money would change her life. Pay off every debt. Set her up for retirement. Let her leave trucking on her own terms rather than being pushed out when the industry inevitably automated. I need time to think, Maria said. Of course. Continue to San Diego. Complete your delivery. When you stop for fuel in Bakersfield, you'll find an envelope in your cab with contact information and contract details. Read it. Consider it. We'll speak again. The radio went silent. Maria drove on through the fog, her mind churning. She passed 3 more empty Peterbilts on the shoulder before reaching Bakersfield. Each one identical to the others, hazard lights flashing, waiting for retrieval. At the fuel stop in Bakersfield, Maria found the envelope exactly where the voice had said it would be, tucked into the driver's side door pocket. Inside was a business card with a phone number and nothing else, along with a USB drive labeled "Contract and Program Details." She didn't plug in the USB drive. Didn't call the number. She completed her delivery to San Diego, then drove back to San Jose, thinking the entire way. The offer was real. That much money doesn't get proposed unless someone serious is behind it. But the idea of helping create the technology that would eliminate human truckers felt like betrayal. And those empty trucks, driving themselves, learning to mimic human consciousness without understanding it, that felt like something fundamentally wrong. An abomination of sorts. Maria made her decision. She took the USB drive to a tech-savvy friend, had him examine it in an isolated system. The drive contained exactly what had been promised: contract details, program information, compensation structure. But it also contained something else. Tracking software. Code that would have activated the moment Maria plugged the drive into any connected device, giving the program's operators access to her computer, her phone, her location. They'd been planning to monitor her regardless of her decision. Maria destroyed the drive. Never called the number. Told no one officially about what she'd experienced, though she shared the story with trusted fellow truckers, warning them to watch for empty Peterbilts on I-5. But the trucks didn't disappear. Maria continued to see them occasionally, usually late at night, usually in fog or rain when visibility was poor. Sometimes they were on the shoulder. Sometimes they were driving normally, keeping pace with traffic. She never got close enough to check if the cabs were empty. And she started noticing other things. Trucks that drove with inhuman precision, never varying speed, never making the small corrections that human drivers make unconsciously. Trucks at rest stops where the cab lights were on but no driver ever emerged. Trucks that seemed to track her with their headlights, following her movements in parking lots. The technology was already here. Already on the roads. The program the voice had described wasn't some future development, it was current reality. Hidden in plain sight among the thousands of trucks moving across the country every night. Maria began planning her exit from the industry. She had maybe 5 years, she estimated, before the automation became widespread enough that human drivers couldn't find work. She started saving aggressively, taking every available run, building a nest egg that would support her transition to something else. But the fear never left her. The fear that one night she'd be driving a lonely highway, and she'd look over at the truck beside her, and the cab would be empty. And that empty truck would turn its headlights toward her, studying her, learning from her, preparing to replace her. Or worse, she'd be the last human driver, surrounded by autonomous trucks that had learned to mimic consciousness so perfectly that no one could tell the difference anymore. Trucks that drove with the habits and quirks of the human drivers they'd studied, ghosts of the truckers who'd been made obsolete, patterns of behavior preserved in silicon and software, continuing forever while the original minds that created those patterns had long since moved on or passed away. Maria still drives. But she checks every truck she passes, looking for the telltale signs. The too perfect driving. The empty cab. The sense of being watched by something that wears the shape of familiarity but contains nothing human underneath. She knows what's coming. She's seen the future driving beside her on the interstate. And it doesn't even know she exists. Story 5, The Frequency. Thomas Brennan had been hauling freight for 19 years, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, when he picked up a signal on his CB radio that led him into 3 days of increasingly surreal experiences. It began in August of 2022, during a routine overnight run from Portland to Seattle along Interstate 5. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and Thomas was making excellent time when his CB radio picked up something that wasn't supposed to be possible. The signal came through on Channel 19, the standard truckers channel, but the voice wasn't speaking any language Thomas recognized. The sounds were linguistic, clearly communication of some kind, but the phonemes and structure were completely alien. It sounded like human speech played backward and layered over itself, multiple voices overlapping, creating harmonics that shouldn't exist in natural vocalization. Thomas checked his CB display to make sure he was on the right channel. He was. He scanned through other channels, but found only normal chatter and static. When he returned to 19, the strange voice was still there, continuing its incomprehensible monologue. Anyone else hearing this? Thomas transmitted. Some kind of interference on 19. Another trucker responded immediately. Hearing what? Channels clear from my end. You got equipment problems? Thomas listened again. The alien voice continued, growing slightly louder, developing a rhythm that was almost musical. You really don't hear that voice? The weird language? Nothing but you and me, buddy. Might want to get your radio checked. Thomas acknowledged and signed off, troubled. His CB was only 6 months old, recently upgraded. Equipment failure seemed unlikely. But if other drivers weren't hearing the voice, that suggested the problem was specific to his receiver. Or he was hallucinating. He decided to ignore it, focusing on his driving. But the voice persisted, continuing its strange speech for the next 40 miles. And gradually, Thomas began to notice patterns. Recurring sounds. Rhythmic repetitions that suggested structure, maybe even meaning. His brain started trying to decode it, looking for linguistic anchors, anything familiar he could grasp. Near Olympia, the voice stopped mid-sentence. The CB went silent except for distant chatter on other channels. Thomas felt relieved, assuming the interference had finally cleared. Then a different voice came through. This one spoke English, but with an accent Thomas couldn't place. Thomas Brennan. Maintain your current route. Do not deviate. You have been selected. Selected for what? Thomas demanded. Who is this? You are one of 47 drivers currently receiving this transmission. You were selected based on specific criteria. Experience. Routes traveled. Psychological profile. Neurological compatibility with the frequency. Continue to Seattle. Further instructions will follow. I'm calling the FCC about this. You can't just hijack CB frequencies. The voice actually laughed. The Federal Communications Commission has no jurisdiction over the frequency you're hearing. We operate outside conventional electromagnetic spectrums. The device in your cab is receiving our transmission through quantum entanglement, not radio waves. There's nothing to report and no one who would believe you. Thomas looked at his CB radio with new suspicion. Someone tampered with my equipment. The modification occurred during your last service appointment. A component was installed that allows your radio to receive transmissions on non-standard frequencies. You've been part of the selection process for 3 months, monitored during normal operations. You've demonstrated the qualities we require. Now comes the test. I'm not participating in any test, Thomas said flatly. I'm completing my delivery and reporting this to my company. You'll do no such thing. If you deviate from the route or speak of this to anyone, you'll be removed from the selection process. Removed permanently. We have invested considerable resources in the 47 candidates. We protect that investment stringently. The threat was clear. Thomas's hands tightened on the steering wheel. What do you want from me? Drive to Seattle. Complete your delivery at the warehouse on Harbor Avenue. Afterward, you'll receive a location. Drive there. Alone. If you comply, you'll be compensated financially and provided with information that will fundamentally alter your understanding of reality. If you refuse, you'll be removed from the selection process, and your life will continue exactly as it is now. Ignorant. Limited. Finite. Finite. Thomas repeated. Humans age, decline, die. The process is inevitable given your current biological constraints. We offer alternatives for those who qualify. That's all you need to know for now. Drive, Thomas Brennan. We're watching. The transmission ended. Thomas drove in silence for the next hour, his mind racing through possibilities. Someone had modified his CB radio without his knowledge. They'd been monitoring him for 3 months. They knew his name, his route, enough about him to create a psychological profile. This was either an elaborate prank or something far more serious and disturbing. The rational choice was to go to police, report the harassment, have his radio examined by legitimate technicians. But the voice had mentioned compensation and information. And there'd been something in the tone, a certainty and authority that suggested this wasn't a game. Thomas completed his delivery to the Seattle warehouse without incident. As he was unhooking his trailer, his cell phone received a text from an unknown number. Just GPS coordinates and a time. Midnight. The coordinates placed the location somewhere in the Olympic National Forest, about 90 miles west of Seattle. Thomas checked his watch. He had 5 hours. Enough time to drive there if he chose to. Or enough time to drive to a police station and report everything. He chose to drive to the coordinates. The route took him off the interstate, onto increasingly remote state highways, then onto logging roads that his GPS barely recognized. By 11:30 p.m., Thomas was deep in old-growth forest, his truck navigating narrow roads that probably hadn't seen maintenance in years. The coordinates led him to a cleared area where 3 other commercial trucks were already parked, their drivers standing in a loose group, talking quietly. Thomas joined them. 2 men and a woman, all appearing to be experienced truckers. They introduced themselves as Carl, Vincent, and Andrea. All had received similar transmissions on their CB radios. All had been instructed to come to this location. Any idea what this is about? Thomas asked. Carl, a heavy-set man in his 50s, shrugged. Some kind of recruiting operation, near as I can figure. Industrial espionage maybe. Or worse. We should leave, Andrea said nervously. This is how people disappear. Before anyone could respond, lights appeared in the forest. Not vehicle lights. These were spheres of blue-white illumination that floated between the trees, drifting closer with eerie grace. The 4 truckers backed toward their vehicles instinctively. The spheres arranged themselves in a circle around the clearing, perhaps 20 of them, each about the size of a basketball, each casting enough light to illuminate the entire area in a cold glow. And in the center of the circle, the air began to distort. Shapes materialized from nothing, resolving into figures that were humanoid but distinctly wrong. Too tall. Proportions slightly off. Faces that were almost human but just distant enough to trigger deep evolutionary unease. One of the figures stepped forward. When it spoke, its mouth didn't move, but the voice was familiar. The same voice from Thomas's CB radio. Welcome. You are 4 of the 47 candidates who have reached this stage. The others are at similar locations across North America. You have demonstrated the necessary qualities. Now we assess compatibility. Compatibility for what? Vincent demanded, his voice shaking. Integration. Humanity is approaching a transition point. Your species cannot survive the coming changes without assistance. We offer that assistance to selected individuals. You would become bridges between human consciousness and something greater. Enhanced cognition. Extended lifespan. Abilities your species categorizes as impossible. In exchange, you serve as ambassadors. Helping us understand humanity while helping humanity accept what it must become. You're aliens, Andrea whispered. That term is imprecise but functionally accurate. We exist in parallel to your reality, intersecting occasionally. Your species has encountered us throughout your history. You create mythologies to explain the encounters. Now we're moving beyond mythology toward integration. Thomas found his voice. Why truckers? Why target commercial drivers? You travel extensively. See much of your world. Exist partially outside normal social structures. You're accustomed to isolation, to long hours alone, to self-reliance. These traits make you suitable candidates. Also, you have access to transportation networks that span your continent. Useful for distribution purposes. Distribution of what? The figure tilted its head, the gesture disturbingly inhuman. That information comes after you accept. But understand this is not negotiable. You've been exposed to the frequency. You've seen us. You cannot return to your previous existence with this knowledge. You either move forward with integration, or we ensure your memories of this encounter are suppressed. Permanently. Carl took a step backward. And if we refuse the memory suppression? Then you're removed from the process. Permanently. There was that word again. Thomas understood now what it meant. Refusal meant death. You're forcing us, Andrea said, anger cutting through her fear. We're offering choices with consequences. A fundamental aspect of consciousness. You can accept integration, accept memory suppression, or choose to leave this place with full knowledge of what you've experienced. The first option leads to enhancement. The second leads to return to your normal life. The third leads to termination. Choose. The four truckers looked at each other, no one wanting to be the first to respond. Thomas's mind raced through the scenarios. Integration meant becoming something other than human, serving as an ambassador to entities he didn't understand for purposes he couldn't predict. Memory suppression meant returning to his life but losing the memory of this encounter, effectively experiencing the same outcome as if he'd never come here. Refusal meant death. Unless he could find a fourth option. How long do we have to decide? Thomas asked. The assessment will take 90 minutes. At the end of that period, you'll make your choice. What does the assessment involve? Cognitive challenges. Psychological evaluation. Physical compatibility testing. The procedures are not painful, but they are thorough. Come. The figures gestured toward a structure that Thomas only now noticed at the edge of the clearing. It hadn't been there moments ago, or hadn't been visible. A building that looked organic, its walls seeming to grow from the earth, surfaces that reflected the blue-white light of the spheres in hypnotic patterns. Carl was the first to move, walking toward the structure with resignation. Vincent followed, then Andrea. Thomas brought up the rear, his mind still searching for an escape, a loophole, anything that would let him survive this without losing either his humanity or his life. The interior of the structure was larger than its exterior suggested, a violation of basic geometry that Thomas tried not to think about too hard. The space was filled with equipment that looked biological and technological simultaneously, instruments that pulsed and shifted, adapting to the presence of humans in the room. What followed was 90 minutes of procedures that Thomas could never fully remember afterward. Lights that probed his thoughts. Substances that were injected or absorbed through his skin. Questions asked in that alien language while something in his brain began to understand the words despite not knowing the language. Physical tests that pushed his body to limits he didn't know he had. And throughout it all, Thomas felt something changing inside him. Not physically, but cognitively. His thoughts began moving faster. Connections forming between concepts that had never seemed related. He looked at Carl, Vincent, and Andrea and could suddenly sense their emotional states, their fears and hopes and the specific patterns of their thinking. When the assessment ended, Thomas knew he'd been changed. The integration had already begun, regardless of what choice he made. The figures gathered the four truckers back in the main chamber. Assessment complete. 3 of you show compatibility. 1 does not. The figure pointed at Andrea. You possess qualities that would be damaged by full integration. Your psychological structure is too rigid. You would break rather than adapt. Therefore, You will receive memory suppression and return to your previous life. Andrea looked relieved, then frightened as two of the spheres drifted close to her, their light intensifying. She slumped unconscious, and the figures carried her back to her truck. The remaining 3 show sufficient compatibility. Do you accept integration? Carl spoke first. What happens to our lives? Our families? You maintain your careers as truckers. From external perspective, nothing changes. But you'll be enhanced. Your routes will occasionally bring you to locations where you'll perform tasks for us. Information gathering. Object transportation. Sometimes you'll serve as intermediaries, contacting other humans we've identified for assessment. In return, your cognitive abilities will expand. Your lifespans will extend to approximately 300 years. You'll gain perception of electromagnetic phenomena invisible to standard humans. And you'll be part of something greater than your individual existence. Vincent asked the question Thomas was thinking. And if we refuse now? Memory suppression. You wake up in your trucks having driven here, fallen asleep, dreamed strange dreams. Nothing more. Thomas looked at the other 2 men. Carl seemed to be leaning toward acceptance. Vincent was harder to read, his face showing conflict. And Thomas realized he could actually sense their decision-making process, feel the weight of their thoughts shifting toward one choice or another. That was part of the enhancement. It had already changed him. I accept, Thomas said. Carl nodded. Me too. Vincent held out longer, indecision radiating from him in waves that Thomas could feel like heat. Finally, he shook his head. I can't. I've got kids. Grandkids. I can't become something they won't understand. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for choosing honesty, the figure said. 2 spheres drifted toward Vincent. He closed his eyes, accepting what was coming. The light enveloped him, and he collapsed. The figures carried him out. Thomas and Carl stood alone with the entities in the organic structure deep in Olympic National Forest. The figures approached them, and Thomas felt something settle over his consciousness like a net, connections forming between his mind and something vast, something that existed across multiple locations and possibly multiple planes of reality. Integration beginning, the voice said, no longer coming from the figures but from inside Thomas's own thoughts. You are now linked to the network. 44 drivers across North America. All connected. All enhanced. All serving the transition. Welcome to the next stage of human evolution. Information flooded Thomas's mind. Routes he needed to drive. Locations he needed to visit. Objects he would need to transport, though he didn't yet understand what they were. Tasks that would unfold over years, decades, centuries. He looked at Carl and saw the same information flooding into the other man's consciousness. They were linked now, part of a network of enhanced truckers, driving the highways of North America, performing tasks for entities that existed parallel to human reality, facilitating some kind of gradual integration between species or dimensions or states of being that Thomas couldn't fully grasp yet. What have we become? Carl asked aloud. Bridges, Thomas answered, the word coming from the network as much as from his own thoughts. We're bridges between what humanity was and what it's becoming. The figures led them back to their trucks. Andrea and Vincent were already gone, their vehicles disappeared from the clearing. Thomas and Carl climbed into their cabs and drove back toward civilization, their minds still reeling from the integration, from the flood of new abilities and perceptions and the understanding that their lives had fundamentally changed. Thomas completed dozens of runs over the following months, many of them routine deliveries, but some leading him to strange locations where he would find packages waiting, unmarked containers that he would transport to other strange locations and leave for recipients he never saw. His cognitive abilities continued expanding. He could drive for days without fatigue. Could sense mechanical problems in his truck before instruments detected them. Could read the intentions of other drivers on the highway, avoiding accidents before they developed. And always, in the back of his mind, he felt the network. 43 other enhanced truckers, scattered across the continent, all connected, all performing their assigned tasks, all serving the gradual integration of humanity with something beyond humanity. Thomas never tried to refuse a task. Never questioned the purpose. The integration had changed him too fundamentally for rebellion. He was no longer entirely human, but he wasn't entirely other either. He existed in between, a bridge built of modified consciousness and enhanced biology, driving endless highways, transporting impossible cargo, facilitating a transition he couldn't fully understand but felt compelled to support. Sometimes, on long empty stretches of highway in the deepest parts of night, Thomas tuned his CB radio to the frequency where it all began. The alien language still transmitted there, continuous and incomprehensible to normal humans. But Thomas understood it now. It was coordination signals. Instructions being broadcast to the network of enhanced drivers. Plans being laid for stages of integration that wouldn't occur for decades or centuries. He listened to those transmissions and understood his role in something vast and slow and inevitable. And he kept driving, because that's what bridges do. They connect. They facilitate passage. They exist in between, neither one side nor the other, but essential to both. And somewhere on the highways of North America, 43 other truckers listen to the same frequency, drive the same endless routes, and feel the same certainty that what they're doing matters, even if humanity will never know their role in its transformation. Story 6, The Infinite Highway. Catherine Walsh had been driving cross-country routes for 16 years when she encountered a stretch of highway in Montana that had no end. It happened in July of 2023 during a run from Billings to Missoula, a straightforward journey along Interstate 90 through some of the most beautiful terrain in America. Catherine had driven this route dozens of times, knew every exit and landmark. She thought nothing could surprise her about this particular stretch of highway. She was wrong. The day started normally enough. Catherine departed Billings at 6 a.m. with a load of construction materials, the weather forecast calling for clear skies and moderate temperatures. Perfect driving conditions. She made good time through the early morning, stopping briefly in Bozeman for fuel and coffee, then continuing west into the mountains. The incident began near mile marker 123, about 40 miles east of Butte. Catherine noticed that the mile markers seemed to be counting down slowly. She'd pass marker 123, drive for what felt like several miles, then see marker 122. Then more driving, and marker 121 would appear. The intervals between markers felt wrong, stretched out, as if the miles themselves had grown longer. Catherine checked her odometer. It was functioning normally, ticking off tenths of miles at the correct rate. But the mile markers contradicted what her instruments were telling her. According to her odometer, she'd driven 15 miles since marker 123. But the signs indicated she'd only covered 3 miles. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe the mile markers were incorrectly spaced in this section. Maintenance error. Replacement signs placed at wrong intervals. But Catherine had driven this route many times. She knew how far the markers should be from each other. Something was wrong with the highway itself. At mile marker 120, Catherine's GPS started glitching. The map display showed her position jumping erratically, sometimes showing her miles ahead of where she should be, sometimes miles behind. The altitude reading fluctuated wildly, indicating she was somehow simultaneously at valley elevation and mountain peak elevation. The distance to her destination kept increasing, adding miles instead of decreasing as she drove. Catherine pulled over at a rest area near mile marker 118, needing to stop, think, and figure out what was happening. The rest area looked normal. Clean facilities, informational signs about local wildlife, a few RVs parked in the designated spaces. She used the bathroom, splashed water on her face, and tried to clear her head. When she returned to her truck and checked her GPS, it showed she'd moved backward. Her position was now at mile marker 125, 7 miles east of where she'd stopped. That was impossible. She'd been stationary. Her truck hadn't moved. Catherine started her engine and pulled back onto the highway, heading west. She watched the mile markers carefully now, counting seconds between them, comparing what she saw to what her instruments told her. Mile marker 117 appeared after exactly 4 minutes of driving at 65 miles per hour. That meant she'd driven over 4 miles, but the marker indicated she'd only progressed 1 mile. The ratio was 4 to 1. For every 4 miles she actually drove, the highway acknowledged only 1 mile of progress. At this rate, the 40-mile journey to Butte would take 160 miles of actual driving. And she'd already noticed her fuel gauge dropping faster than normal. The physical distance was real. Her truck was consuming fuel at the normal rate. But the highway was stretching, expanding, creating additional space that shouldn't exist. Catherine grabbed her phone and called her dispatch. "Hey, it's Catherine. I'm having a weird situation on 90. The mile markers aren't matching my odometer. I think there's something wrong with my GPS." "Define wrong," the dispatcher responded. "It's showing my position jumping around. And the distance to Butte keeps increasing instead of decreasing. I've been driving for 2 hours but I'm somehow further from my destination than when I started." A pause. "Catherine, are you feeling all right? Any symptoms of illness? Dizziness? Confusion?" "I'm fine. I'm telling you the highway is wrong. The space between mile markers has increased. I'm driving 4 miles for every 1 mile of progress. That doesn't make sense. I know it doesn't make sense. That's why I'm calling. Has anyone else reported problems on this stretch?" The dispatcher checked. Catherine could hear keyboard clicking in the background. "Negative. No other reports." "Look, complete your current interval to the next mile marker and tell me exactly how long it takes." Catherine agreed and focused on the road. Mile marker 116 appeared ahead. She reset her trip odometer to 0 and noted the time. She drove at exactly 60 miles per hour, using her cruise control to maintain perfect speed. She counted the minutes. 4 minutes and 30 seconds later, mile marker 115 appeared. 4.5 miles of actual driving for 1 mile of acknowledged progress. Catherine reported this to dispatch. 4.5 minutes at 60 miles per hour. That's 4.5 miles. But the marker says I only went 1 mile. More silence on the other end. "Catherine, I'm going to have someone meet you in Butte. I think you need to take a break. Maybe see a doctor. You might be having some kind of episode." "I'm not having an episode. Send someone out here to verify. Have them drive from Billings and check the mile markers." "I'll send someone. But it'll be hours before they can get to your location. In the meantime, just continue your route. Try to make it to Butte." Catherine hung up, frustrated. She kept driving, watching the mile markers crawl by with agonizing slowness. Mile 114. Mile 113. Mile 112. Each one requiring multiple miles of real driving to reach. Her fuel gauge dropped to half tank. Then to a quarter. She should have had plenty of fuel to reach Butte and refill there. But at this rate, with the actual distance being 4 times longer than expected, she was going to run out. Catherine spotted a trucker stopped on the shoulder ahead, hazard lights flashing. She pulled over behind him, hoping for answers or at least confirmation that she wasn't losing her mind. The trucker was an older man, maybe 60, standing beside his rig and staring at a mile marker with an expression of complete bewilderment. Catherine approached him. "You seeing this too?" she asked. The man turned to her, relief washing over his face. "Thank God. I thought I was going crazy. The mile markers are wrong. I've been driving for 3 hours and I've gone 8 miles. 8 miles. That's impossible." "It's worse than that," Catherine said. "We're actually driving the distance. Our trucks are using fuel at normal rates. The space is real. The highway has expanded somehow. That's insane, the man said. Highways don't expand. Space doesn't work that way. I know. But it's happening. They compared notes, discovering they'd both entered this section of highway around the same time, both experiencing the same phenomenon. The man, who introduced himself as Leonard, had a theory. I've heard stories from other truckers, Leonard said. Weird phenomena on certain highways. Stretches of road where normal rules don't apply. Usually it's temporal distortions. Time loops or time dilations. But I've never heard of spatial expansion before. The highway literally getting longer. How do we get out of it? Catherine asked. The stories say you have to complete the stretch. Drive through it. Can't turn around, that just resets you to the beginning. Can't exit the highway, exits in affected zones usually just loop back to the same section. You have to push through to the end. The end is Butte. That's still 30 miles of acknowledged highway. Which means maybe 120 miles of actual driving. I don't have that much fuel. Leonard checked his own gauge. Neither do I. We're stuck. They stood in silence for a moment, the morning sun climbing higher, traffic continuing to pass them without stopping. Other truckers who apparently weren't experiencing the same effect. Catherine wondered if the phenomenon was selective, targeting specific vehicles or drivers. What if we siphon fuel from one truck to the other? Catherine suggested. One of us might have enough to make it through. Then they can send help back. Leonard considered this, then nodded. I'll give you my fuel. I've got less cargo, less weight. If one of us makes it, it should be you. You're younger, probably got more years of driving ahead of you. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. Besides, maybe whoever gets out can figure out how to rescue whoever stays behind. Better than both of us being stranded. They siphoned fuel from Leonard's tank into Catherine's, a process that took nearly an hour. Catherine ended up with 3/4 of a tank, hopefully enough to complete the expanded highway. What will you do? Catherine asked Leonard. Wait here. Conserve fuel for heat if it gets cold tonight. Eventually someone will notice and send help. Or the highway will return to normal. These things don't last forever, according to the stories. Catherine climbed back into her truck, guilt settling heavy in her chest. She was abandoning Leonard on an impossible highway, taking his fuel, saving herself. But he was right. Better one person escape than both being trapped. She drove on. Mile marker 111. Mile 110. Mile 109. Each one an eternity away. The highway stretched before her, shimmering in the heat, looking normal despite the spatial distortion. Other vehicles passed her going the opposite direction, oblivious to the fact that they were driving through expanded space. Catherine tried her CB radio, hoping to reach other truckers who might be experiencing the same thing. Any drivers on Interstate 90 between Bozeman and Butte, this is Catherine Walsh. Is anyone experiencing problems with distance or mile markers? Please respond. Static answered her. She tried multiple channels, got no response. The fuel gauge dropped. 3/4. 2/3. Half. The miles crawled by. Catherine found herself in a meditative state, the repetitive act of driving through unchanging landscape creating a hypnotic effect. She lost track of time, focusing only on the mile markers and her fuel gauge. Mile marker 90. Mile marker 85. Mile marker 80. The highway was doing something else now too. The scenery was repeating. Catherine passed the same rock formation 3 times. The same dead tree appearing on both sides of the highway at different mile markers. The same ranch house visible in the distance from multiple positions. The highway wasn't just expanding. It was looping back on itself somehow, creating impossible geometry where east and west occupied the same space, where she could be driving forward while the landscape suggested she was moving in circles. Catherine's fuel gauge hit a quarter tank. She calculated quickly. If the expansion ratio held, she might not make it. Might run out of fuel 10 or 20 miles short of Butte. But then, at mile marker 75, something changed. The ratio shifted. Catherine drove only 3 miles to reach mile marker 74. Then 2 miles to marker 73. Then 1 mile to marker 72. The highway was contracting, returning to normal space. Catherine's relief was overwhelming. She pushed her speed to 70, eager to exit the affected zone before it could expand again. The mile markers began passing at normal intervals. Her GPS stabilized, showing her correct position, accurate distance to Butte. She reached the city limits with her fuel gauge on empty, coasting into a truck stop on fumes. She refueled, then immediately called highway patrol to report Leonard stranded back at mile marker 112. "We've already responded to that location," the patrol officer told her. "No one there. No truck. No signs of anyone. That's impossible. I left him there 3 hours ago. He was out of fuel, waiting for help. Ma'am, we've had 3 different reports of stranded vehicles in that area today. Every time we respond, there's nothing there. No vehicle, no driver, no evidence anyone was ever present. We're starting to think it's a prank." Catherine hung up, stunned. Leonard had disappeared. Just like the highway had expanded and contracted, he'd apparently vanished into whatever impossible space the phenomenon created. She completed her delivery to Missoula, but couldn't stop thinking about Leonard. About the infinite highway that had stretched space itself, creating miles that shouldn't exist, consuming a trucker and his rig as if they'd never been real at all. Catherine drove that route dozens more times over the following months. She always watched the mile markers carefully between Bozeman and Butte, checking for signs of spatial distortion. Occasionally she'd notice minor discrepancies, moments where the distance between markers felt slightly off. But never again did she experience the full expansion, the 4-to-1 ratio that had trapped her and Leonard. She searched for information about Leonard afterward. Put his description out on trucker forums, checked missing person reports. Found nothing. No one matching his description was reported missing. No abandoned trucks found in Montana. It was as if he'd been erased from existence entirely. And Catherine wondered if maybe Leonard had never existed at all. If the highway that expanded space had also fabricated a person to populate that expanded space, giving her someone to interact with, someone whose fuel she could take, someone who could disappear once the highway contracted without leaving any evidence that would raise questions. The infinite highway had created miles that shouldn't exist. Maybe it had also created a trucker who shouldn't exist. A ghost made of expanded space, as temporary and impossible as the extra miles Catherine had driven. She still drives Interstate 90. Still watches the mile markers. Still remembers Leonard and his willingness to give up his fuel so she could escape. And sometimes Catherine wonders if she actually did escape, or if she's still driving through expanded space, experiencing an infinite highway that allows her to think she reached Butte while actually remaining trapped between mile markers, living in a loop of highway that stretches forever, populated by ghosts and impossible miles that have no end. Story 7, The Passenger Who Wasn't There. Raymond Foster had been hauling freight for 21 years, mostly solo operations where he spent days or weeks on the road without meaningful human contact beyond brief interactions with dock workers and gas station attendants. He preferred it that way. The solitude suited him. But in December of 2022, during a cross-country run from Los Angeles to Boston, Raymond picked up a passenger who changed everything he thought he understood about reality and consciousness. The hitchhiker appeared on Interstate 40 in New Mexico, standing on the shoulder near mile marker 168, just west of Albuquerque. It was 3 a.m., temperature hovering around freezing, and the figure wore only light clothing. Raymond normally never picked up hitchhikers. Company policy strictly forbade it, and the liability risks were enormous. But something about the figure's posture, the way they stood perfectly still while snow began to fall, triggered a protective instinct Raymond didn't know he possessed. He pulled over and climbed down from his cab, approaching the figure cautiously. As he got closer, he realized the hitchhiker was a young woman, maybe 25, with dark hair and pale skin. She wore jeans and a t-shirt despite the freezing temperature, and she wasn't shivering. "You need a ride?" Raymond asked. "You're going to freeze out here." The woman looked at him with dark eyes that reflected his headlights strangely, like an animal's eyes caught in a flashlight beam. "Yes. I need to go east." "As far as you're traveling?" "I'm going to Boston." "That's about 2,000 miles. "Perfect." Something felt off about the interaction, but Raymond couldn't identify what. Maybe it was the woman's complete lack of affect. No visible relief at being rescued. No gratitude. No fear or anxiety despite being stranded on a freezing highway in the middle of the night. Just flat acceptance. "What's your name?" Raymond asked. "Sarah." "I'm Raymond." "Come on, get in the cab before you catch hypothermia." Sarah climbed into the passenger seat with fluid grace, moving with a precision that seemed choreographed. Raymond returned to the driver's side and pulled back onto the highway, cranking the heat up to warm his unexpected passenger. "What were you doing out there?" Raymond asked. "Car breakdown." "I was waiting," Sarah said simply. "Waiting for what?" "For you." Raymond glanced at her. "For me specifically?" "How would you know I'd be driving this highway?" "I knew you'd come." "I've been waiting for you for a long time, Raymond Foster. 21 years driving trucks. Originally from Portland, Oregon. Never married. No children. You live alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Sacramento. You prefer the solitude of long-haul routes because human interaction exhausts you. You've been lonely your entire life but convinced yourself you prefer it that way." Raymond's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "How do you know all that?" "I know everything about you. I know you had a brother who died when you were 12. Drowned in a swimming accident. You blame yourself even though you weren't there when it happened. I know you dropped out of college after one semester because you couldn't handle the pressure. I know you've thought about suicide 17 times over the course of your life but never attempted it because you're afraid of pain. I know you, Raymond. Better than you know yourself." Fear was replacing Raymond's protective instinct. "Get out." "I'm pulling over and you're getting out." "No, you're not. You're going to keep driving because you want answers. You want to know how I know these things. You want to know what I am." She was right. Raymond didn't pull over. He kept driving, his curiosity overriding his fear. "What are you?" he asked quietly. "I'm your reflection," Sarah said. "Your consciousness, externalized. Given form and voice. I'm every thought you've ever had, every memory you've stored, every possibility you've imagined. I'm you, Raymond. Just wearing a different shape. That's insane." "Is it? How else would I know your private thoughts? Your secret fears? The things you've never told anyone? I'm not reading your mind, Raymond. I am your mind. I'm the part of you that observes the rest of you. The internal narrative voice that never stops talking. Right now, for example, you're thinking that I might be a hallucination. A stress-induced breakdown. You're wondering if you should check yourself into a hospital. Those thoughts aren't coming from you, Raymond. They're coming from me. I'm the process of thinking, given independent existence." Raymond tried to deny it, but something in Sarah's words resonated with truth. The way she spoke matched his own internal monologue. The rhythm and phrasing were identical to his own thought patterns. "Why? Raymond asked. Why are you here like this? Because you're ready. After 21 years of isolation, of running from human connection, you've reached a threshold. Your consciousness has turned inward so completely that it's begun to manifest externally. I'm the result. Your mind attempting to create the human contact you've denied yourself. I don't want human contact. Lie, Sarah said flatly. You're desperately lonely. You've constructed an entire identity around the idea that you prefer solitude, but it's a defense mechanism. You're afraid of rejection, so you reject first. You're afraid of intimacy, so you maintain distance. You've spent 2 decades convincing yourself you're content, but you're dying inside, Raymond. Slowly suffocating on isolation. Raymond felt tears burning in his eyes. Sarah's words were cutting through every defense he'd built, exposing truths he'd hidden even from himself. So what happens now? He managed. We drive to Boston. We talk. You listen to yourself for once. Really listen. And maybe, if you're capable of it, you change. You acknowledge the loneliness. You accept that human beings aren't meant to exist in complete isolation. You take steps to reconnect with the species you've spent so long avoiding. They drove in silence for several miles. Raymond's mind was reeling, trying to process the impossibility of his passenger while simultaneously feeling the truth of everything she said. What if I can't change? Raymond asked. What if I'm too damaged, too set in my patterns? Then I disappear. Your consciousness stops manifesting externally. You continue driving alone, and eventually the isolation completes its work. You become truly empty. A biological machine operating without any internal life. It's already happening, Raymond. You've noticed yourself feeling less over the years. Emotions flattening. Experiences losing meaning. That's not depression. It's erasure. Your consciousness withdrawing because it has nothing to engage with. I don't want that. Then change. For the next 6 hours, Raymond and Sarah talked. Or rather, Raymond talked to himself through Sarah's voice, externalizing decades of suppressed thoughts and feelings. He talked about his brother's death, the guilt he'd carried. About his failed attempt at college and the shame of disappointing his parents. About every romantic opportunity he'd sabotaged because vulnerability terrified him. About the slow process of convincing himself that isolation was strength rather than the slow death it actually represented. Sarah listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that forced Raymond to dig deeper, examine motivations he'd never consciously acknowledged. It was the most honest conversation Raymond had ever had, and it was entirely with himself. As dawn broke over the Texas Panhandle, Sarah said something that stopped Raymond's heart. You need to understand something, Raymond. I'm not going to stay. This externalization is temporary. Your consciousness can't maintain 2 forms indefinitely. By the time we reach Boston, I'll be gone. Reabsorbed. You'll be alone again. But the awareness will remain. You'll remember this conversation. Remember what you've admitted to yourself. The question is whether you'll act on it or let yourself slip back into the comfortable lie of chosen solitude. How do I act on it? Small steps. When you get back to Sacramento, accept a social invitation instead of declining. Go to that coffee shop you pass every day. Talk to the barista. Her name is Michelle and she's noticed you but you've never made eye contact. Join that driving club you've bookmarked but never visited. Attend a family gathering instead of making excuses. Each small act of connection weakens the isolation. Eventually, you rebuild the capacity for intimacy. Or you don't, and you die alone, having lived a life of deliberate disconnection. They crossed into Oklahoma, then Arkansas, then Tennessee. The miles accumulated. Raymond found himself talking less, becoming quiet and reflective. Sarah remained present but silent, allowing him space to process. At a truck stop outside Nashville, Raymond caught sight of himself in a mirror and had a disturbing realization. The reflection didn't match how he felt. He looked older than he remembered, tired, worn down by years of isolation. When had he aged so much? When had the lines deepened around his eyes, the gray spread through his hair? Sarah appeared beside his reflection in the mirror, and for the first time, Raymond saw the resemblance. Same eyes. Same facial structure. Sarah wasn't just wearing a different shape. She was wearing his shape, feminized and made younger, but fundamentally identical. You see it now, Sarah said. You've been looking at yourself the entire time. They continued east, through Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. As they approached Boston, Raymond felt something changing. Sarah was becoming less solid, her voice quieter, her presence fading. The reabsorption had begun. I'm scared, Raymond admitted. Scared of going back to how I was. Scared I'll forget everything we've talked about and slip back into isolation. You might, Sarah said, her voice barely audible now. Change is hard. Old patterns are comfortable. But you have a choice, Raymond. That's all anyone has. The choice to change or remain the same. They reached the Boston delivery warehouse at 8 a.m. on the 5th day of the journey. Raymond completed the unloading, handling the paperwork on autopilot, his mind focused on Sarah waiting in the cab. But when he returned to the truck, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. No evidence anyone had ever sat there. Raymond checked the sleeper berth, looked under the seat, searched the entire cab. Nothing. Sarah had vanished completely. Or more accurately, she'd been reabsorbed into the consciousness she'd emerged from. Raymond sat in the driver's seat, feeling her absence like a physical wound. But he also felt something else. Awareness. The truths they'd discussed remained clear in his mind. The self-deception about preferring solitude. The fear of intimacy. The slow death isolation represented. Raymond started his truck and began the long drive back to Sacramento. But this time, he didn't turn on the radio to fill the silence. He let himself sit with his thoughts, examining them instead of suppressing them. And he made a decision. When he got home, things would change. Small steps. Coffee with the barista named Michelle. A family gathering he wouldn't make excuses to avoid. Maybe even therapy to work through the guilt about his brother's death. The journey back took 4 days. Raymond drove without picking up any more hitchhikers, real or imagined. But he didn't feel alone. Sarah's presence, though reabsorbed, had left something behind. An internal voice that was more honest, more aware, more willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Back in Sacramento, Raymond did exactly what he'd promised. He went to the coffee shop. Talked to Michelle. Accepted her invitation to a local poetry reading. It was awkward and uncomfortable and everything Raymond normally avoided. But it was also real. Human connection, genuine and undefended. Over the following months, Raymond's life changed gradually. He attended more social events. Reconnected with family members. Even started seeing a therapist who helped him work through his grief about his brother. The isolation that had defined 2 decades of his life began to crack, letting light in. And sometimes, late at night in his apartment, Raymond would catch himself having an internal dialogue that sounded exactly like his conversations with Sarah. Questions and answers flowing between different aspects of his own consciousness. He understood now that Sarah hadn't been separate from him. She'd always been there, the observing part of his mind, the internal narrative. She'd simply manifested externally for a few days to force him to pay attention. Raymond never picked up another hitchhiker. Never saw Sarah again in physical form. But he carried the memory of that journey from New Mexico to Boston, those 6 days of talking to himself through an externalized aspect of his own consciousness. And he knew that everyone carried their own version of Sarah inside them. That observing voice. That internal dialogue. Most people never had it manifest externally, never had to confront it in physical form. But it was always there, commenting, judging, remembering, processing. Raymond had simply been isolated enough, turned inward enough, that his consciousness had nowhere else to go but outward. Creating a passenger from his own mind. A reflection that could speak back. A hitchhiker who was really just himself, taking human form to deliver the message he'd been refusing to hear. You're dying inside. Change, or accept the erasure. Raymond chose change. And though Sarah was gone, reabsorbed into the consciousness she'd emerged from, her message remained. Carved into Raymond's awareness. Impossible to forget. Story 8, The Bridge to Nowhere. Frank Morrison had been driving long-haul trucks for 17 years when he encountered a bridge in northern Minnesota that existed in multiple states simultaneously. It happened in February of 2021 during a delivery run from Duluth to Fargo, a route Frank had driven perhaps 100 times over the course of his career. The bridge in question crossed the Mississippi River near Grand Rapids, a standard concrete structure that Frank had traversed countless times without incident. Until the night everything about that bridge changed. The weather was brutal. A winter storm was sweeping across Minnesota, dropping temperatures to -20 Fahrenheit and creating whiteout conditions. Frank probably should have pulled over and waited out the storm, but he was behind schedule and desperate to complete his delivery on time. His company had implemented a new punctuality policy that resulted in financial penalties for late deliveries, and Frank couldn't afford to lose the money. He approached the Mississippi River Bridge at 9:40 p.m., visibility reduced to perhaps 50 feet despite his headlights. The bridge appeared ahead, its structure barely visible through the driving snow. Frank began his crossing, noting that the bridge deck felt rougher than usual, his truck bouncing over irregular surface conditions. Halfway across, something changed. The bridge lights, which had been functioning normally, suddenly shifted in color. The standard yellow sodium vapor lights became blue-white, casting everything in a strange cold glow. The guard rails on either side of the bridge, which had been modern steel construction, suddenly appeared to be older wooden railings, the kind used decades ago before modern safety standards. Frank slowed his truck, confusion overriding his urgency. The bridge felt different too. Longer. He was certain he should have reached the far side by now, but the end of the bridge remained distant, receding as he drove toward it. His GPS screen flickered, then displayed something impossible. It showed his truck in the middle of the Mississippi River, not on a bridge, but apparently driving on open water. The elevation reading showed he was somehow both 200 feet above the water and at water level simultaneously. Frank brought his truck to a complete stop in the center of the bridge. Or what he thought was the center. Distances had become unreliable. He climbed down from his cab, intending to look at the bridge structure and figure out what was happening. The cold hit him immediately, far worse than the -20 he'd been expecting. This was Arctic cold, the kind that froze exposed skin in seconds. Frank's breath crystallized in the air, creating ice particles that fell to the ground like tiny bells ringing. He walked to the edge of the bridge and looked down at the Mississippi River below. Except it wasn't the Mississippi River he knew. The water was frozen solid, ice extending in all directions, but the ice was wrong. It glowed with internal light, blues and greens shifting beneath the surface like aurora borealis trapped in frozen water. And in that glowing ice, Frank saw shapes. Vehicles. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, suspended in the ice like insects in amber. Cars and trucks from various eras, some modern, some vintage, all perfectly preserved, all positioned at various depths as if they'd driven off the bridge at different times and been immediately frozen. Frank backed away from the edge, terror overwhelming rational thought. He returned to his truck, climbed into the cab, and attempted to continue across the bridge. But when he started driving, he immediately realized something was wrong with direction. He was certain he was driving forward, toward the far side of the bridge, but the structure stretched ahead of him without end, and when he checked his mirrors, the near side of the bridge had also disappeared into distance. The bridge had become infinite. Frank tried turning around, performing a careful multi-point turn to head back the way he'd come. But when he completed the maneuver and started driving in the opposite direction, the bridge still stretched infinitely ahead of him. There was no near side and no far side. Just an endless span of concrete and steel extending in both directions through the storm. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank. Frank did quick math. At his current idle rate, he could keep the engine running for heat for maybe 12 hours before running out of fuel. After that, in minus whatever temperature this was, he'd freeze to death in his cab. He grabbed his CB radio, desperately hoping to reach someone. "This is Frank Morrison on the Mississippi River Bridge near Grand Rapids. I'm stuck on the bridge. It's become infinite. I can't find either end. Anyone reading me? Anyone?" Static answered him. But beneath the static, Frank heard something else. Voices. Multiple voices, overlapping, speaking on top of each other. Some were calm, some panicked, some resigned. All were saying variations of the same thing. "I'm trapped on the bridge. Can't find the end. Been driving for hours. Fuel's almost gone. Someone please help me." Frank recognized what he was hearing. Other drivers. Trapped on different versions of the bridge, all transmitting on the same frequency, all experiencing the same impossible phenomenon. "How long have you been here?" Frank transmitted. "Any of you, how long have you been trapped?" A woman's voice cut through the others. 3 days. I entered the bridge 3 days ago. Drove until I ran out of fuel. Now I'm just waiting to freeze." "For days," a man's voice added. "Food's gone. Water's gone. I can see other bridges when the snow clears. Multiple bridges occupying the same space. Different times. Different states of decay. We're all here, but we can't see each other. Can't help each other." Frank looked out his windshield and, for a moment when the wind shifted and visibility improved, he saw what the man had described. Multiple bridges, translucent, overlapping, occupying the same physical space but existing in different states. One was the modern concrete bridge he'd entered. Another was an older steel truss bridge. A third was ancient, built of wood and stone, a structure that probably dated back a century or more. All existed simultaneously, all infinite, all populated by trapped travelers who couldn't reach each other despite occupying the same location. "What is this place?" Frank whispered. An older voice, rough with cold and exhaustion, answered him. "Best anyone can figure, it's a confluence. A point where multiple realities intersect. The Mississippi River is old. Sacred to indigenous peoples. A boundary between different territories. When you build a bridge across such a boundary, sometimes you create weaknesses in reality. Points where different times and possibilities bleed together. We're caught in that bleeding. Stuck between what was, what is, and what might have been. How do we get out? Most don't. They run out of fuel, freeze, and their vehicles eventually appear in the ice below. You saw them, didn't you? All the trucks and cars in the frozen river. Those are us. All the drivers who got trapped over the decades. Or maybe over centuries, depending on which bridge version you count from." Frank refused to accept that. There has to be a way. Some pattern, some key to escape. Maybe. Some vehicles disappear from the ice periodically. Could be they found an exit. Could be they just faded away as the bridge consumed them entirely. No way to know. Frank sat in his idling truck, thinking furiously. The bridge existed in multiple states. Multiple times. That suggested it wasn't a stable structure but something fluid, shifting between possibilities. If he could identify the pattern of shifts, maybe he could time his driving to exit during a moment when the bridge resolved into a single stable state. He watched the overlapping bridges carefully, trying to discern a rhythm to their appearances. The modern concrete bridge seemed most solid between roughly 9:45 and 9:50 p.m. The steel truss bridge dominated between 9:50 and 10 p.m. The wooden bridge appeared between 10 and 10:05 p.m. Then the cycle repeated. Each version of the bridge was infinite during its dominant period. But during the transitions, when one was fading and another appearing, there might be moments of instability. Moments when the bridge was neither infinite nor finite but something in between. Possible exit points. Frank checked his dashboard clock. 9:53 p.m. 7 minutes until the next transition from steel bridge to wooden bridge. He positioned his truck in what he estimated was the center lane, prepared to accelerate hard the moment the transition began. The minutes crawled by. Frank watched the overlapping structures, seeing the steel bridge growing more solid, the modern concrete bridge fading. At exactly 10 p.m., the transition started. The steel bridge began to lose definition, its edges blurring. The wooden bridge started to materialize, still translucent but gaining substance. Frank floored his accelerator. His truck lurched forward, engine roaring, speed climbing. The bridge ahead flickered, alternating between infinite and finite, the far side appearing and disappearing. Frank drove faster than was safe, especially in a snowstorm on a potentially icy bridge, but he had no choice. This was his exit window. The far side of the bridge stabilized ahead of him. Real. Solid. Frank aimed for it, his truck barreling forward at 70 miles per hour. The transition was completing, the wooden bridge becoming dominant, the steel bridge fading away entirely. Frank's truck hit the end of the bridge at full speed, bouncing violently as it transitioned from bridge deck to roadway. He nearly lost control, the trailer fishtailing, but he corrected and kept driving, putting distance between himself and the bridge. In his rearview mirror, he saw the bridge flicker one more time, then resolve into a single structure. The modern concrete bridge. Normal. Finite. No longer infinite. Frank pulled over 2 miles down the road, shaking so hard he could barely hold the steering wheel. He grabbed his CB radio and called back to the bridge. "I'm out. I made it. If anyone's still trapped, the transition happens every 15 minutes. Between 10 and 10:05, when the bridges are shifting. That's your exit window. Gun it and don't slow down." He repeated the message multiple times, hoping the other trapped drivers would hear it and have the fuel remaining to make the attempt. Frank never received confirmation that anyone else escaped. He completed his delivery to Fargo, then filed a detailed report with his company about the incident. The company dismissed it as stress-induced hallucination, possibly caused by carbon monoxide exposure from a malfunctioning heater. They ordered him to have his truck inspected and suggested he take a psychological evaluation. The truck inspection found nothing wrong. Frank declined the psychological evaluation. He drove the Duluth to Fargo route many more times over the following months, always approaching the Mississippi River Bridge near Grand Rapids with apprehension. The bridge appeared normal during those crossings. Finite. Solid. A standard concrete structure that took maybe 45 seconds to cross. But Frank never crossed it at night again. Never risked entering during the hours when the bridge might shift into its infinite state, when multiple versions might occupy the same space, when trapped drivers transmitted their desperate messages through CB static. And sometimes, on his route, Frank would scan CB frequencies randomly and pick up fragments of those transmissions. Voices from drivers still trapped, or perhaps echoes of drivers who'd been trapped years or decades ago, their final messages bleeding through time, warnings that went unheeded. Can't find the end. Been driving for days. Fuel almost gone. Please, someone help. Frank documented every instance, kept a log of the transmissions, tried to identify patterns. He contacted authorities, urged them to investigate the bridge, place warnings, close it during certain hours. No one took him seriously. The bridge remained open. Drivers continued to cross it. And occasionally, Frank would hear about a truck or car that went missing somewhere between Duluth and Fargo, last known position near Grand Rapids, vehicle never recovered. He wondered how many of those missing vehicles were sitting in glowing ice beneath an infinite bridge, suspended in amber, waiting in multiple timelines simultaneously, driven by people who'd made the mistake of crossing at the wrong moment, during the brief windows when reality fractured and the bridge became something other than what it appeared. Frank kept driving. But he carried the knowledge that not all bridges go somewhere. Some bridges go nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Some bridges exist in the spaces between possibilities, connecting not two sides of a river but multiple versions of reality. And once you're on that kind of bridge, there's no guarantee you'll ever reach the other side. You might just drive forever, trapped in infinite span, becoming another vehicle in the ice, another voice on the CB radio, another warning that future drivers will hear and dismiss as interference or imagination or stress-induced hallucination. Until they cross the bridge at the wrong time and discover too late that some structures aren't meant to be crossed, they're meant to trap, to hold, to collect the travelers who dare to use them. Frank Morrison knows this truth now. And he spends his remaining years trying to warn others, knowing that most won't listen, most won't believe, and some will cross that bridge near Grand Rapids at exactly the wrong moment and disappear into the infinite, becoming permanent residents of a structure that exists everywhere and nowhere. Spanning not distance but the impossible spaces between what is real and what might be real and what should never have been real at all.